Hey everyone, Joe here. Today I'm going to give you a behind the scenes on a mix that I've done recently for a client. Got a fantastic prog rock song here with a bunch of synths, and I'm going to show you three of my favourite techniques, three techniques that I used in this mix on how to get them to sit right in the mix, how to make them stand out from each other, and how to make sure you can hear all of them clearly. You're going to hear what they all sound like together, and I'm going to show you the techniques that I used to achieve this sound. And then at the end, I'm going to give you an extra little tip on just how to get them glued together and how to get them sounding smooth and nice with the rest of the track. Let's begin. So before we start, let's just have a quick listen to what the mix sounds like as a whole with all the synths and everything in there. Okay, so we've got a lot going on there. We've got 11 synths to try and mix together, along with 5 guitar tracks. It's all very busy, and especially when you first bring them into the mix, it can be quite overwhelming. They all sound a bit muddy together, but we want to make sure we can hear every single synth on there because they're fantastically played and written. We don't want any of them to get lost, and we don't want to take anything away from the rest of the instruments in the mix as well. So the first point I want to discuss is the panning. I'm just going to open these out a little bit so you can see what's going on with the panning there. I don't have everything panned in the middle. I have thought carefully about where I'm going to pan things to keep them from getting muddy in certain areas of the stereo field, and also keeping them interesting and exciting to listen to. So let's take a look at them in turn. We've got this, what do we call it, retro log synth. So this plays through the entire song. It's quite bassy, so what I've done is pan that centrally. I keep the bass guitar in the middle, I keep the kick in the middle. To get a nice, solid, punchy bass, it really is a good idea to keep it in the middle generally. And then we have these two, let's call them Belly On and Sink and Scream. Now these two are pretty much the same kind of part, played just with slightly different sounds. Let's have a listen. And they play throughout all of the verses and then in the middle 8 section a little bit as well. So because these are very similar, what I've done is I've panned them completely hard left and hard right. So we're still retaining that balance. You're not getting one side heavier than the other, but it really widens it out. It makes space for the other instruments, and also they're quite top end heavy. So again, that works well in this mix. I'm trying to keep the bass towards the center. So let's have a listen to both of them together. Really nice and wide, and leaves room for that other synth in the middle. In comparison to if they were both in the middle, it's much harder to tell the difference between them, and it just sounds a little bit muddy and weak, and especially with the other synths there as well. They just kind of all blend into one. Another important thing to consider with rock synths is where your guitars lie. So we've got this lead guitar here, for example. In the sections where there's lead guitar, I've tried to keep the synths sounding nice and wide to make space for it in the middle. So nothing is detracting from the solo. And then at the end, we've got a few extra synths that are only playing in certain small sections, or that change towards the end, and in which case they're not always quite the same left and right, but I've used panning to try and give the same kind of energy to both the left and the right. So you've got this one leaning slightly to the left, and this one leaning slightly to the right. And then this round trip synth is kind of all over the place, but it works. I've used a stereo imager to really widen it out. And obviously it's got that automated panning. Just that movement helps it to stand out because none of the others have that kind of movement. And then the final point to make with panning is don't forget it's not just a set it and forget it kind of thing. You can use automation to change what's happening throughout. So, for example, the belly on synth here is only on one side. It doesn't have that matching synth on the other side. So I've panned them using automation more towards the center here. So it's not super heavy on the left. The second thing we're going to look at is EQ to keep things from getting muddy and also differentiate the different synths from each other. So starting with this first synth, the bassy one, like I said, I kept it in the middle because it's got a fair amount of low end, but the track also has, being a rock track, it has a bass guitar. Following a similar kind of pattern, so I didn't want to get it muddy. So what I've done is used a high pass filter to cut off almost everything below 100 Hertz. And then in particular, where the bass is heavy at around 200 Hertz, I've cut that down a little bit. So still got a fair amount of low end in there, but it doesn't muddy up with the bass guitar. And then I've cut off, using a low pass filter, everything above 12 kilohertz, because again, we don't need to take up that top end as the other synthesizers will do that. You can also use EQ to help synths to stand out from each other, to give them their own space in the frequency spectrum. So for example, if you turn the EQs off on this fizz organ and cornflake synth, it's kind of a little bit hard to hear what that staccato synth is doing, and it just sounds a bit muddy in general. So what I've done, I've EQ'd the organ so it just sounds how I wanted it to sound. Again, cut off some of the low end and boosted that top end at about 10k, because you can hear that kind of fizzy distortion, which I quite liked. But then with the other synth that plays alongside it, I've cut that off. So you got a boost at around 10k on the first one, but then I've completely cut off the 10k on the second one, past about 5k actually. I've got this kind of telephone effect here, so it also, the high pass filter also cuts off below 700. So we're only taking up this small section of the frequency spectrum. And when you turn these two on, let's hear it without first and then turn the equalizers on. It's a lot cleaner, it's a lot less muddy, and then when you've got the guitars in as well, it means that you'll still be able to hear everything clearly. Let's have a listen with the guitars. Okay. And the third thing we're going to look at is the various other effects that we've used across the various synths to help them to stand out and make them sound more interesting. So it's very likely you're going to be using reverb on your synths, especially if there hasn't been any reverb on the samples themselves on the keyboards. So I've used the same reverb, this basic plate reverb, across all of the synths, but I haven't just slapped it on top of the synth bus, because then I wouldn't be able to control the level between each of the synths. Much better idea to just send each of the synth tracks individually to the auxiliary bus that has the reverb on, because then you can control the level of reverb to suit the individual track. So for example, this bassy one, I've kept the level of reverb quite low, because with bass tracks especially, it can start getting really muddy if you put a lot of reverb in there. It just kind of gets a bit boomy. And then on the other tracks, I've varied the level of reverb individually, depending on what best suits the section of the song. So in this kind of middle eight, this kind of ethereal ambient section, the synth that stood out for me was this CP 2006. This kind of electric keyboard, electric piano type thing. Quite a lot of reverb on there. But then on the other synths that go with it, there's a fair amount less. I didn't want to put a huge amount on both of them, because then it will start to become a wall of sound, and then we'll lose some of that standout piano solo in the middle. You'll hear what I mean. And then we got this one too, which again is a bit lower. But yeah, if they're all really roomy, it might take away the focus on that one that you really want the listener to hear. But obviously it depends on the song. Music production is an art form, and it depends what you think is best for the song. I've already mentioned the stereo images that I've used when we were talking about the panning. There's another technique that I've used with a delay, not in the traditional sense of having a delay effect, but if you listen to these two synths that we've got panned, hard left and hard right, the one on the right has a little 12 millisecond delay. See what happens when we turn that off. It goes straight back in the middle. Because they're basically played the same, your ears aren't differentiating them, so it sounds like it's just in the middle. So just by putting a tiny little delay on one side, it really widens it out. So those are my 3 main points on how to mix rock synths. I'm going to give you an extra little tip, as I said. So we've got all the synths sounding nice, got compression across the board where needed. But then the final thing that I like to do is send them all through a mix bus and use a multi-band compressor. Now, a multi-band compressor lets you compress different areas of the frequency spectrum differently. And that's really useful on a bus like this, where we've got so many different types of synths. We've got bass synths and things more in the top end. So if you have a quick listen, that's without the multiband on. And then with it on. Got it compressing a little bit harder on the low end there, just to keep it from getting muddy when we hear with the full track, which I'll play again in a second. It also gives you a little chance to just shape the EQ across the board if you think that in general the synths need to go down at a certain frequency or up. But it just keeps the whole set of synths sounding tamed and glues them together a little bit. Let's hear one final time with the full mix. So we've looked at the panning, the EQ and the effects and different techniques on how you can use these tools to get your synths sitting right in your rock song. I hope you've enjoyed this behind the scenes and you've learnt something as well. Feel free to drop a comment below. Let me know what your favourite use of synths in a rock song is. And if you want to see more tutorials like this, then hit that subscribe button and I'll see you next time.